Welcome back, everyone. So now we have a couple more topics for week 1, part A. For this video, we're going to start with something called type conversions. This is essentially how you go between different types. Today, we're going to focus on how to switch between numerical types and strings. Alright, so let's say you have a numerical type, such as an integer or floating point value, and you want to represent it and store it internally in your Python code as a string. So the way you do that is you use this type conversion ability called str. str is shorthand for string. So you str parentheses, and then inside the parentheses you put the number that you want to convert into a string. Alright, so for example, str parentheses 6 will give us a string with 6 in it. str parentheses 6.0, this is a floating point value, right, because of the 0.0. That will give us 6.0 as a string. It's pretty nifty. You can also go the other direction. Alright, so let's say you have a string, right, and let's say the string has numbers in it, and you want to convert the numbers in the string into a numerical type. That way you can actually do some math calculations with it. Alright, so let's say we have a string. 6 is the only character in the string. You can convert that into an integer in your Python code by using the type conversion ability called int parentheses. Inside you put the string that you want to convert to an integer. So int parentheses string 6 will give us 6 back as an integer. You can do the same thing with floating point values, right? So if you want a floating point value instead, you use the word float, and this is, again, these are special Python keywords that we've been talking about. So float parentheses the string that has the number in it that you want to convert. In this case, we're doing 6 again. So this will give us 6.0 as a floating point number. Couple things to keep in mind when you're working with type conversions. The types have to be compatible, alright? Which means, let's say for example you have a string that has 6.0 in it. Alright, so 6.0, we know that's a floating point number, right? So in Python, if you have a string that's, quote 6.0, end quote, you cannot convert that to an integer. Alright, you can only convert that to a float. So you have to be careful, make sure that whatever is inside that string makes sense for whatever type you are trying to make it. Another thing to keep in mind is you can't do a type conversion like int parentheses string 6.5, 6 plus 5. You can't do that. The string doesn't know how to do math calculations. So you'd have to individually convert a string that just has 6 in it and a string that just has 5 in it, and then do the math calculation after. Alright, so just make sure that whatever's inside your string, if you're trying to convert it to an integer or floating point number, that it makes sense to become an integer or floating point value. Why am I talking about this? Well, it's super important when you're working with input and output. With input specifically, you know how when we were talking about input, variable name equals input some prompt, right? We talked about input and output last week. So whenever the user types in something on the keyboard as a response to that input prompt, whatever is stored into that variable is going to be stored as a type string. Alright, so even if the input prompt asks something like, how old are you, right, and you type in a number, it is always going to be stored as a string. That's just how input works. That's the rule with input. It always reads it in as a string, right? So in order to do actual math calculations, say with the age that you type in, before you can do any math with it, you have to change it from string to a numerical type. Alright, so please make sure you check on Canvas. There is a practice page on Canvas called Practice with User Input and Numerical Types. that will go through sort of a demo of writing code that explains why you need to do these type conversions sometimes, especially when you are working with input. So please make sure you check that out. Also, just in general, make sure you look at the other practice pages, right? So starting this week, I am going to start to post additional practice pages, additional meaning more than just the notes for the week. So take a look at the other practice pages. Sometimes there will be how-to pages as well. The practice pages are there for you to practice it that you learned in class. It'll provide more examples and stuff like that. And then the how-to pages are essentially demos of how to do new things. So please make sure you are reading through all the material on Canvas this week. Again, if at any point any of the material doesn't make sense or you have questions, just let me know. Post on the discussion forum or send me an email. Alright, let's also talk a little bit more about strings in print. So we talked about strings last week, right? Again, strings are a type, and then print is one of those built-in Python abilities. Print is a special Python keyword. So let's talk a little bit more about them today. Alright, so a couple more things about strings. So let's say you have a string in your code, like hello, for example. You can find the length of a string by typing len. Len is another one of these Python special keywords, parentheses, and then inside the parentheses put the string. Alright, so for example, if you do len parentheses the string hello, you're going to get 5 back. Len essentially gives you the length of the string. It tells you the number of characters that are in that string. The length of the string is always going to be an integer, right? That makes sense. Counts up the number of characters, going to be an integer. You can use this result in math calculations, right? So since it gives you an integer, you can use that in any one of your math expressions. So another thing to mention about strings, there's a thing called the empty string. So the empty string, it's the string that has nothing in it, right? So again, strings are sequences of characters. So if you want to have something that is of type string but doesn't have anything in it, there are cases for this. We'll get into it later in the quarter. You can make what's called the empty string. To make an empty string, you just type 2 quotes, either your 2 double quotes or your 2 single quotes, and you don't put anything in between the quotes. So that is still a piece of data, that is still a data value of type string. The length of it is 0, right? Because again, length tells you the number of characters in the string. Something that I do want to point out though is that on this second bullet point here, these 2 strings have a space character in them, right? So even though it looks like there's nothing in them, there is something in them. The space character counts as a character, alright? So the string that just has a space character in it, that is not the empty string. Because the length of this string with the space character in it is 1. So the empty string is literally only the string that has nothing in it. It's only the string whose length is 0. Alright, so do keep that in mind. Alright, string concatenation. So this is something that's super important and you'll probably be using a lot in your code. So you can essentially add strings together. I want you to be careful at using the word add though when you're working with strings. The technical term for quote-unquote adding strings together is called concatenation. It really just means smushing together 2 strings into one longer string. Alright, and you use the addition operator to do this. So let's say you have 2 strings, HE and LLO. You can put them together by concatenating them. Essentially use that plus operator and that will give you one big string back, hello, that's made up of these 2 smaller strings. And it smushes them in the order that they come in, right? So since I typed HE first and then I said plus LLO, the LLO will come after the HE in the resulting string. Alright, so the order in which you do the string concatenation does matter. Something you do want to keep in mind though with string concatenation is that you cannot use this plus operator on different types, right? So you can use them on two numerical types, you can use them on two string types, but you cannot mix numbers and strings together, at least not directly. Alright, couple workarounds on this though. So for example, HE plus 5, that's not going to work because that 5 is an integer, this HE is a string, you can't do that. You could though, for example, add these two strings at the bottom here, HE plus the string that contains 5, right? So be really, really careful about your types. Even though we as humans kind of read these as the same, Python internally stores them differently. So pay attention to those types. If you were to concatenate these two strings at the bottom here, the resulting would be HE5 as one long string. So again, you can't mix strings and numerical types directly. Something you can do though is using those type conversions that we just talked about, right? So if you have, let's say, an integer, like 5, that you want to put into a string using string concatenation, again, you can't just add it directly. You can't just say, hey, take this string and concatenate the number 5 to it. But you can say, hey, take this string and concatenate the string that you get when you do str parentheses whatever the number is. Alright, so those type conversions, super important. If you have a number, you want to convert it to a string, str parentheses number inside. That will give you a string back. So again, with this plus operator, you can use it on two numbers. You can mix up integers and floating point values, but you cannot mix up such numbers with strings, at least not directly. You can if you do this type conversion stuff though. So be mindful of that. Alright, couple more things I want to talk about with strings. So again, strings are sequences of characters. I want to highlight some special characters that you could use in your strings. So an escape character is one of these special characters that starts with a backslash. Alright, so here's an example of an escape character. \n, that is an escape character. It is a single character, which means create a new line. So if we were to have this \n inside a string, such as this example, hello \n world, and then we printed that string, it would automatically put a new line wherever that \n character is in that string. So this special character, this \n, this is the new line character. This is how you can force new lines in places to make your output more readable. Another escape character is the tab character. So this is the same sort of idea as the tab on your keyboard. It's approximately 4 or 5 spaces. So tab is another escape character. The way you write that in a string is \t. Alright, so going with this hello world example again, if I do hello \t world as a string and then I print that, it will print the words hello world with a tab in between them. So these escape characters, these are really there to help you sort of format your output better. Something that's interesting about escape characters is even though you have to type 2 keys on your keyboard to type the character, we call them special characters because Python treats escape characters as one single character. Alright, so even though \n has 2 things in it that you have to type, its length is 1. It's the same thing with \t. Its length is also 1. So these are very special characters in Python. Python reads them as if it's just one individual character. the only reason why we have to type it as 2 characters is so that we can differentiate between new line character and N, for example, or tab character and T. So we have to type 2 things on our keyboard, but Python reads it as 1 single character. So be careful about that. Alright, I want to talk about a couple more things about print. So really quick print review. We talked about this, I forget if it was day 1, maybe day 2, but sometime in the first week we talked about this. So by default, each print statement will print the string inside of it on its own line, right? Or print whatever is inside of it on its own line. So in this example, we have 2 prints. So out comes 2 lines, hello and world. Alright, you can change this. Alright, so let's say you have multiple print statements and you don't want them to all be on their same line. So to change it, you add this extra end equals inside of your print statement. Alright, so you have print the string, comma, end equals another string. In this example, our end equals a space character. So what will happen is we'll print hello. Instead of going to a new line before printing world, there will be a space character instead, and then world will come out. So this is if you want to avoid the fact that print always prints on its own line. You can change what it ends with by saying end equals some other string. It can be any string that you want. This example just has a space character. You can change it to whatever you want though. Here's another example. End equals the empty string, right? Again, the empty string is the string that has nothing in it. So this is a way you could end it with basically nothing. So when you print this, hello and world will be right up against each other, right? Because you said, hey, instead of making a new line, you are going to end it with nothing. So this is a way that you can avoid the sort of default behavior of the print statement. Another thing you can do with print, remember how we talked about print can print or display multiple values on the same print line if you separate those values by commas? And by default, those values will be separated by a space. So for example, x equals 5, and then when you print this string and x, that string and the value that's stored in x will have a space added to it, right? Remember when we talked about this comma separation? So you can also change this, right? So you can change print both in terms of what it ends with, and again by default it's a new line. You can also change what it's separated with, right? So again by default anything that's separated by commas in the code will come out separated with spaces in the output. So if you want to change what it's separated with in the output, it's the same sort of idea. You have the values you want to print, comma, sep equals some string. So you use this word sep, sep. You give it some string, and again it can be any string you want. Could be one of the special escape characters, could be something random like 3 exclamation points, could be the empty string, and then when it comes out as output, these commas, instead of coming out of spaces, will come out as whatever string you give it in sep. So in this example, the output would be the value is exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point 5, because we said, hey, print these 2 things, separate them with 3 exclamation marks. Again, the rule is with both this end and this sep, whatever you give it, it has to be a string. So do keep that in mind. And the last thing I want to talk about with today's video is that these 2 lines of code will display the same message. So the 2 lines of code, they look a little bit different, let's look at this first one. This first one, it's printing two different items. It is printing the string CSC and then the number 110, the integer specifically 110. Again, by default, that comma means it'll come out with a space in between the two of them. This second set of code over here, this is going to print the same thing as well. So this is using the string concatenation operator that we talked about, and it is concatenating two strings, the first of which is CSC with a space character in it. Right, so CSC space, and then it concatenates the integer 110 once it's converted to a string. Alright, so this is concatenating two strings, CSC space and the string which contains 110, and both these will display the same message. Something that I do want to point out about string concatenation is if you are using string concatenation for your output, you have to make sure that you explicitly add in spaces where they need to be, like I did here with this first string CSC space. So make sure you explicitly add in those spaces. So at this point, you should be able to go back and revisit your week 0 programming assignment and edit it a little bit so that you can change any of the sort of wonky output that you might have had. Right, I mentioned in the lab assignment from last week and the programming assignment notes that if you had extra spaces in your output, that is okay. With the content that you've learned today, you can now go back and change that. I do recommend doing that now rather than waiting, because you are going to work on this week 0 programming assignment code again at a later date. You don't have to do this before the programming assignment is due on Wednesday this week, but it would still be good practice for the content that you learned today. That said, if you have any questions about the content of this video, feel free to post the discussion forum or send me an email.